Magic is a game with a tremendous amount of different decks and themes, especially in Commander. And Storm is not only one of the most iconic, but also one of my personal favorite themes. The Storm mechanic has led to the banning of cards in multiple formats, and there are a bunch of Storm cards that have been banned as well. It's infamous for the long drawn out turns, where in competitive Magic you need to sit around and wait for because you never know when they might fizzle and fail to storm off. Storm was such a powerful mechanic that lead designer Mark Rosewater named the Storm Scale after it. If you don't know the Storm Scale, it's a measure of how likely a mechanic is to show up again. And powerful mechanics like Storm or Dredge are very highly rated, meaning they're not likely to show up. The Storm Scale itself is very interesting. I'll have a link in the description for you to check out. Cards with the actual Storm mechanic are pretty few and far between, but over the years, there have been Storm decks in many formats. But as of writing this script in 2024, if we look at the metagame page for Modern, Storm is basically dead. Pauper had their Storm cards banned. Pioneer has one Storm-like deck, but no actual Storm cards. Standard has not had a Storm card in a long time, and in EDH, Manual Storm has mostly been superseded by combos, though there are a few commanders that still show up in EDH occasionally. Legacy and Vintage are really the only places where you commonly see Storm, but most players don't engage with those formats at all, so honestly, when was the last time you saw a proper Manual Storm deck? One that actually tries to cast 20 plus spells and use a Storm card as a finisher. Storm is one of my favorite archetypes ever, and the deck I've been playing longest is a Manual Storm deck. So this is my guide to the lost art of Storm for EDH. I'll go over the archetype, colors, price, power, weaknesses, everything you need to know to build a Storm deck. But first, if you like my videos, consider subscribing and checking out the Patreon. Thanks. First, we need to look at what Storm does. Storm says when you cast this spell, copy it for each spell cast before it this turn. A couple of things to note here. Storm does count your opponent's spells as well. It's all spells that have been cast, which is why something like Flusterstorm is so powerful against Storm decks. Another important thing is that Storm happens when the spell is cast, meaning a spell copy effect just gets one copy, not the entire Storm effect. So if we look at a Storm card like the new Amphibian Downpour, if your opponent casts a creature and then you cast this, you'll get one other copy, right? Because that's the second spell cast. There has been one spell cast previously, making Amphibian Downpour a 2-for-1 removal spell. This is the most basic way to use Storm, a card that can be double or tripled up if you throw in a cantrip or wait for your opponent to cast something. Now that we know what Storm does, what makes a Storm deck? Just having a Storm card as your finisher is not really the same as being a Storm deck. You can use cards like Grapeshot as a finisher to a Tidespout combo, but that's not a Storm win, that's a combo. You have 2 cheap mana rocks, the Tidespout, and the Grapeshot. A guaranteed win if you have all these cards. Not that having a combo in your Storm deck makes it no longer a Storm deck, but I'll get into that more later. So let's look at a classic modern Storm deck. I know this is about EDH, but bear with me. This deck aimed to untap with a cost-reducing card in play like Baral or Electromancer, and then using mana-neutral cards like Manamorphose, or mana-positive cards like Rituals, you could get a lot of mana since the cost is reduced. Then the deck will cast cantrips and rituals until you hit 19 spells, and cast a Grapeshot as the 20th. Or oftentimes you would cast 10 spells and then Past in Flames to just cast the same Grapeshot twice. Casting your Storm spell twice does give you more Storm, as opposed to copying it. The hallmark of a Storm deck is none of this is guaranteed. There isn't a set formula of you Manamorphose into this ritual, into this cantrip, into this, then you win. It's a combo you have to put together on the fly. You don't know what you're going to draw off the Manamorphose. You don't know what you're going to draw off the cantrip. You have to figure out what you're doing mid-combo. If you don't get enough rituals, you run out of mana. If you don't hit enough card draw, you might have mana, but no way to draw into your win con. Failing to storm off is called fizzling, and usually means you're probably going to lose. Which brings me to the weaknesses of a Storm deck. The reason they've fallen out of favor in almost every competitive format is that there are almost always better ways to win, usually with a combo. Why build a deck where the combo only wins 90% of the time, when you could instead build a combo deck that wins 100% of the time once it gets the combo? Also, since Storm decks have so many moving parts, they fold to almost any type of stacks. Rule of Law effects, Graveyard Hate, or spot removal for those cost reducers are all really great ways to slow down a Storm deck. So why play Storm? If it has all of these issues, it's just worse than a combo deck. It's fun! I mean, come on, we're playing EDH here. It's for fun. Storm is really exciting to play. Finding a win is like solving a puzzle. Looking at your hand, looking at the board, and trying to determine if you can cobble together an actual win is just such a blast. Sometimes I'll take out my Storm deck and just goldfish it to see how early I can try and go for a win. Goldfishing, by the way, is when you play a deck against nobody just to test it. Fun fact, that's where the MTG Goldfish channel gets their name. Okay, so you believe me that a Storm deck is fun to play. Where do you start? Well, let's look at colors. There was a time where you could build a Storm deck in any color combination easily. I saw Jund Storm, Selesnya Storm, and even some great colorless options. But sadly, Paradox Engine, my beloved, is banned. So now your options are a little bit more limited. Blue and red are by far the easiest, but I'll go over how to make a Storm deck in every color. Red has rituals, which give you a ton of mana, especially combined with cost reducers. Plus, red has a reasonable amount of cantrips actually. It's very easy to just fill your deck with these types of rituals and have a lot of Storm action going on. And you have amazing commander options. Bergi, Zada, Urbrask. Blue doesn't have rituals, but instead land untapping effects. Cards like Snap, Turnabout, Frantic Search are all mana neutral, meaning if you add a cost reducer, there's suddenly mana positive effects. And you have excellent commander options as well, Orvar and my beloved Jace. Blackstorm is pretty interesting because there are actually some rituals, although not as many as red, but there are lots of other effects that let you sacrifice creatures for mana, and you can easily turn those effects into cards as well. Kirk, Son of Yawgmoth, and Mastermind Plum are great options here. Greenstorm is pretty interesting. Normally when you think of green, you don't think of instants and sorceries, which is why they're often creature-based Storm decks. All of the Sylvalas are great options here. Basically, you want a creature or multiple creatures that can tap for mana, hopefully more than one mana, and then you can use creature untapping effects to continually get more mana, basically turning these into rituals. White and colorless I'm gonna lump together because both of these are best as artifact Storm decks. Artifacts have a lot of cost reducers, which can be used to make the cost of mana rocks go down. And especially when you pair this with rocks that tap for more than one mana, you can easily turn them mana neutral or mana positive. Teshar is pretty great here for mono white, or SRAM can work as well if you're playing all Cheerios. In colorless, your options are a little limited. You could probably build something out of Peregrine Dynamo or Thraxos if you really wanted. And of course, if you're a multicolored deck, combine all of these things. If you're in black and red, suddenly you have access to a huge amount of rituals. So feel free to mix and match all of these ideas based on what you're building. Normally, you won't have enough mana to actually cast 20 spells in one turn, meaning we need some way to cast all of these spells. This is where enablers come in. These are cards that, in our Storm turn, get us more mana. Some of the most common are cost-reducing effects. Normally, traditional ramp is just better in casual commander, but if you plan to cast multiple spells in a turn, a cost reducer can often be way more effective. And there are cost reducers for whatever you're trying to storm with. Artifacts, creatures, instants or sorceries, or just if you're in monocolor, pick one of the medallions. These are getting reprinted in MH3, so get them while they're cheap. Beyond cost reducers, there are other ways to get more mana mid-storm turn. If you want to go for an Artifact Eggs style deck, something like Krark Clan Ironworks, or KCI for short, is a great way to do that. KCI can turn 0 mana artifacts into +2 mana, and 1 mana artifacts into +1 mana. If you have a lot of these and ways to draw cards, you can churn through your deck pretty fast. You can also do the same with creatures. Ashnod's Altar, Phyrexian Altar, or that new Goblin from MH3 are great ways to turn creatures into mana, and there are tons of ways to get fodder on the board. There are so many enablers for Storm decks. Some can be generic, like rituals you can put in basically any Storm deck, or maybe something more specific. Something like Kuldotha Rebirth in Jaheira with a haste enabler can easily be +3 mana. It really depends on what you're playing, so find ways that you can net more mana mid-turn. Mana isn't everything. You're going to need card draw to actually find the Storm finishers. Cantrips, which are low-cost cards that draw 1 card, are generally the go-to for most combo decks, including Storm. Cantrips are great since you get one card deeper and have +1 Storm count for a low mana cost. This is why blue is the best for Storm and red to a lesser extent, because they have cantrips. Luckily for non-Izzet decks, cantripping is not everything. You also need regular card draw. The problem with cantrips is eventually you hit lands and then won't do anything. So you need other cards that actually give card advantage. Delve spells are great if you cast a bunch of cantrips. X spells are also excellent, since they work well with cost reducers and let you dump any excess mana from rituals into them. Okay, we have enablers and we have card draw. Now we need to figure out how to actually win the game. One of the easiest win cons to add to any Storm deck is Aetherflux Reservoir. It gains life for each spell you cast, so not exactly Storm count. This is actually a huge gripe I have with Aetherflux. It means when you're storming off, you need to keep track of total spells cast for Storm and spells you cast this turn, because it's different. Regardless, Aetherflux Reservoir can easily get you to the 151 life to blast away the whole table. If you don't want to use Reservoir, then there are other Storm finishers. Keep in mind how many spells you need to cast for these to actually win the game. Like Grapeshot, for example. This is going to be really difficult to win with, because you likely won't cast 120 spells. Instead, Tendrils of Agony does twice the damage, so you only need 60 spells. And that also might sound like a lot, but remember, the second time you cast Tendrils, it's going to be even more. So oftentimes you want ways to recur Storm spells back to your hand and cast it multiple times. This way you can get that win much more easily. Then there are token generating Storm cards. These are also great finishers. Usually you want a haste enabler or an anthem or some other effect that deals damage when creatures come into play. If you have something like a Perforos, you can definitely storm off and make enough tokens to take the whole table out. Another bit of tech here is extra turn spells, even those red ones that lose you the game next turn. If you do one huge storm turn where you summon a massive amount of goblins with Empty the Warrens, you can Final Fortune to take one extra turn, basically as a haste enabler, and then drop your anthem and swing out. Lastly, you can have a combo finish. I know I said that combo decks are not really Storm decks, but it's more how you find the combo. If you're just playing removal and card draw to slow down the game until you get your combo, then you're not a Storm deck. It's about non-deterministically spinning into the combo with wheels and card draw and cantrips that makes it more of a Storm deck. In terms of power level, how strong are Storm decks? So there are variances that can affect the power level a lot, usually depending on how much setup you actually need before you can pop off, or how consistently you can find your important pieces. But honestly, Storm decks are not super strong. Part of the reason this is the lost art of Storm is because the archetype has fallen off a cliff in every competitive format. You can build a Storm deck that is strong and consistent and fast, but it will never be stronger, faster, or more consistent than a combo deck with lines that has guaranteed wins. In Commander, we have 1-card combos with Inala, 0-card combos with Godo, so I don't think any Storm deck, even maxed out on power, can really be more than Fringe CDH, Tier 2 CDH. But for Casual Commander, I think it's somewhat powerful. Storm decks can really punish players who are not aggressive enough and don't play enough non-creature removal to get rid of the enabling cards. But otherwise, it still folds to removal in the same way that a lot of other combos do, so I don't think it's too strong. I would put Storm in Casual Commander at upper mid power. Now, is it expensive monetarily to build a Storm deck? And although I do think a budget Storm deck is possible, budget is also a pretty limiting factor for these decks. You often have 1 or 2 key cards that are really crucial, so tutors are pretty important. And if you're not in red, the budget problem is actually even worse. Because outside of red and I guess Dark Ritual, the best mana positive cards are all colorless fast mana pieces. Yes, Sol Ring is easy to get, but Mana Crypt, Mana Vault, Mox Diamond, Grim Monolith, Chrome Mox are all very expensive. Usually I don't think the Moxes with card disadvantage are really worth it in Casual Commander, but in Storm decks, they kind of are. A Mox Diamond is so good mid-Storm turn because it's just +1 mana and you get rid of a useless land you didn't need. I don't want to discourage anyone from trying to build a Storm deck on a budget, especially if you stay in red. I'm just saying it's more difficult to build a Storm deck on a budget than other themes. Okay, so let's put everything together. Enablers, card draw, win cons. What does a finished Storm deck look like? Well, I have my Fringe CDH Jace deck that I've been playing and tuning for years. Let's take a look at it there's also a link in the description for you to check out. Since this deck is mono blue, High Tide and Extra Planar Lens are great enablers. High Tide really is the best option here. It basically doubles your mana if you have all islands. And even though it's only for one turn, a mana doubler for 1 mana is insane. I actually think people should be playing this in almost every mono blue deck in casual anyway, even if you're not a Storm deck. The Extra Planar Lens is mostly a backup plan if High Tide gets exiled or countered or whatever. This deck is chock full of tutors for High Tide and artifact tutors for the lens. Once you resolve High Tide, those blue untapping effects are all mana positive. Like with Snap, for example, you can tap 2 islands for 4 mana, and then spend 2 mana on Snap to untap both of those, giving you an extra 2 mana. With the Commander though, Jace lets you go crazy. The flip side is a Planeswalker that lets you cast an instant or sorcery in your graveyard. The goal is to cast High Tide again, which means your islands tap for 3 mana each. So now Snap is going to gain you 4 mana, because you tap 2 lands for 6, and spend 2 on the Snap. This deck aims to use a double High Tide with 5-ish lands in play, and all of these untapping effects to storm off. The deck is full of cantrips to hit those tutors early game, or churn through the deck during the storm turn. And then big untapping effects like Time Spiral and Hour of Revelation are often enough cards and mana to win the game. This deck usually wins by casting enough spells with an Aetherflux in play to win the game. There is a Scepter Reversal combo backup, or if you have 6 lands in play and 1 High Tide effect, Palinchron will go infinite, or 5 lands and 2 High Tide effects, or 4 lands, 2 High Tide effects, and a Sapphire Medallion. And if that sounds convoluted, that's because it is. You usually don't know how you're going to win because the deck uses wheels to draw into those wins. And this convoluted nature is why I love the deck so much. Each game is going to be different to find the actual win. Sometimes the correct line is copy artifact on a reservoir to double the life gain. Sometimes the line is to cast Reversal by itself to untap your mana rocks to get that little boost of mana to cantrip a little further to find your next untapper. Or maybe it's casting a Mind's Desire for 6, casting all of those spells, and then flashing back the Mind's Desire for now 12. And sometimes you find Displacer Kitten as an engine and you're able to just use that to get mana. There are so many different ways this deck can go off. It's just so fun to find different ones every time. I want to finish this video off by giving you some overall tips on building and playing Storm. 1. You should goldfish the deck a lot. Take your playmat out and play the deck a bunch. Storm decks often take long turns because they're very complicated and require a lot of spells to be cast. You should know your deck inside and out. You should know what you're going to tutor for in each situation. Please practice your deck a ton before taking it into a real game. Honestly, you should be doing this with most decks, but it's especially important for Storm. Second is to bring tokens to represent floating mana. If you have a bunch of dice on the table, it can be confusing to figure out what's mana, what's storm count, or whatever else. If you don't want to make or buy mana tokens, you can use basic lands. Third, don't worry too much about the board. Removal is good to have and important. Sometimes you'll run into a card that really hurts the Storm plan and you need to remove it. But otherwise, try to focus more on getting enablers in play and not worrying too much about chip damage. Even if you're at 1 life, if you manage to storm off, you probably won. So that's how to build a Storm deck. Enablers to get your mana mid-turn, cheap and efficient draw to churn through your deck, and some finisher that makes use of all the spells you've cast so far. Storm is an incredibly fun and challenging way to brew and play. It's a dedicated combo deck that needs real setup to get going, but once you learn a Storm deck, it can be so rewarding. I encourage you to give it a try and be patient. It's a learning process. Storm is difficult. You're going to lose to your own deck multiple times, and especially if someone throws removal at you mid-combo, it can really shake up your game plan, and it just means you need to do more adjusting on the fly. But if you like decks that win in different ways every single game, I think you might like Storm. Let me know your favorite Storm commander in the comments below, and drop other Storm deck building tips down there as well. Thank you so very much for watching, and special thanks to my tier 3 patrons, whose names you see here. If you want to be in the credits or check out any of the other perks, link to my Patreon is in the description.